Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today in session 177 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I am joined today by John McElwee, and to borrow a phrase from Aubrey Daniels, John's been in the field before there was a field. And John has had a long and productive career that's had some very interesting twists and turns, and he's still going strong these days and learning new things to help individuals with a wide variety of developmental and behavioral challenges. With that in mind, I suppose an overarching theme in this episode could be thought of as how John charted his own career path. In other words, by being open to new experiences and actively investing in his professional development, he's been able to do some really interesting things in the field of ABA. So for early career professionals, try to listen to this episode with this aspect in mind. And in this episode, we discuss how John first got into the field, the detour he took in his graduate training to work as a union electrician, the work he did in the area of marriage and family systems, his connections with folks like Drs. Alan Kasdan and Russell Barkley, and lots more. In the latter half of the show, we spend a considerable amount of time discussing how John discovered relational frame theory by chatting up Dermot and Yvonne Barnes-Holmes at an ABA conference, and how he saw the benefits of using this approach with individuals with ASD in an early intervention context. Along the way, we discuss the upcoming webinar series that John's doing with Peak Behavioral. If you're interested in learning more about this, it starts in March of 2022. You can find information about this webinar series as well as individualized coaching opportunities with John through Peak Behavior Services website, and that's pkservice.org/purchase. If this is something you're interested in and you'd like to save a few bucks in the process, use the promo code podcast22 at checkout to receive a discounted price on John's webinar. This podcast is brought to you with support of the Whoop Strap. I've been wearing the Whoop Strap for over a year now, and I really enjoy getting the quantitative information on all aspects of my health, including sleep analytics, heart rate variability, calorie burn, and Whoop's proprietary strain score. I can go on and on about the virtues of this neat device to you, but instead you can go check it out for yourself. And to get the first month free, you can head over to behavioralobservations.com/Whoop to learn more. We're also brought to you by institutional tier patron GreenSpace Behavioral Technology. GreenSpace Behavior offers cutting-edge supervisor coaching, performance and competency-based trainings, and organizational supports for new BCBAs and trainees. Find out how you can optimize your supervision practices, improve clinical outcomes, and increase employee satisfaction over at greenspacebehavior.com. And of course, we're brought to you by the aforementioned Peak Behavioral, where you can sign up for John's webinar series, again, using the discount code podcast22 at checkout. And I'll have the links for all these things in the show notes over at behavioralobservations.com. That's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with John McElwee.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
John McElwee, welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast. How you doing today?
Very good, and thank you for having me, Matt.
The pleasure's mine. It's certainly mine now after we spent the last 30 minutes or so, probably close to 40, troubleshooting this call. So from what I understand, there is internet problems in the state of Pennsylvania.
Right, and it started exactly at 8:30.
Yeah, I know. It's like someone had it in for us today to not have this call, and but we soldiered on. So
we did.
Excellent. Well, this has been a conversation I've really been looking forward to, and I suppose in a break from my typical show prep, especially when I don't know somebody personally, a lot of my show prep involves just kind of some email exchanges and whatnot, but we had a couple of really fun phone calls ahead of this, and got to razz each other about our respective football teams.
I knew you'd bring that up, Matt.
we'll just leave the details of that aside right now, especially since this will be, this content is, so-called evergreen. So, whichever way the razzing goes can probably come back to bite us in the butt down the road. So I think we'll just kind of leave that there. So
I'm sure it will.
Well, all joking around aside, we've got a lot of fun things to talk about.
Great.
And, one of the neat things about what we have in store to chat about is just some of the very different things that you've been involved with across your lengthy career here. So I look forward to getting into that. And perhaps to set this in context, let's start off like we always do here. And I'd like to hear about how you encountered behavior analysis first, what made you want to pursue it, and what was the state of the field at the time in which you did discover it as well? I think that would be another interesting kind of thing to describe.
The state of the field. Well, first of all, Matt, there was not a field.
And I grant you that.
I was at a little Jesuit college here in Pennsylvania, King's College, and I initially was kind of interested in the helping fields. And I was a sociology major. The school didn't even have a psych department at that point in time. But in my sophomore and or junior year, a psych department came in, and there was a guy by the name of Dr. Ken Weiss was the chairman of the department, and I became very, very interested in it. He was a very interesting guy. He was doing research actually where he would teach rats to run a maze. Then he would euthanize the rats, take parts of their brain, put them in other rats, and see if they could run the maze without making errors and things like that.
Wow.
So I'm not sure where all that ended up. I know Ken is no longer at the university, but anyway, he got me interested in psychology, and I became more interested in kind of like the experimental branch of psychology at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So that when we were looking to try to get into a graduate program, I wasn't interested in the traditional clinical psych program. And we looked around and we found a couple that we were interested in. And lo and behold, I got accepted at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada, which I didn't even know where Calgary, Alberta, Canada was. Initially I was looking like in Ontario or Toronto or someplace like that. And then we found out, no, that's the wrong direction, John. You got to go way, way west.
Mm.
So I went there, and the program was actually experimental psychopathology.
I see.
I mean, that sounds even better than applied behavior analysis, as far as I'm concerned. So that was
experimental psychopathology. Yeah,
that was the course. And my graduate mentor and faculty advisor that I have was a guy by the name of Eric Mash. And Eric had studied at the University of Florida, and then he did postgraduate work at Kansas University, where he worked with, Wolf and Bear and those type of people. So he was, and so when I went there, the coursework was, we had like Albert Bandura's book on observational learning, and we had, I think it was Frederick Kampfer had a book out on more of a behavioral approach. That was when, Joseph Volpe now starting to do work with treating phobias using kind of like a classical conditioning type of model. They had a fellow that was head of the department by the name of Charles Costello, who did a lot of work on depression, where he was talking about loss of reinforcer effectiveness as kind of like involved in depressive symptomology. So very
behavioral analysis of these
right.
These conditions.
It was more of an experimental behavioral learning type of approach involved with these types of conditions. And Eric Mash was very, very interested in the work of a fellow by the name of Jerry Patterson, who worked at the Oregon Research Institute. And he did really some classic work, and he published a number of classic little manuals that are for working with parents with behavior problems with neurotypical youngsters, temper tantrums, noncompliance, issues like that. And he wrote, he had a book called Families. He had another book called Living with Children. These were, small little pocket manuals. And they were where you would read a paragraph, and then he actually used, I think, like a program instruction type of approach where you kind of fill in the answers based on the information that you had just read. And his main bailiwick was he developed the transcription system, or he would send in observers with this detailed transcription system, and they would watch families interact where they had troubled teens or troubled youngsters, what we call troubled in the sense of, yelling, screaming, fighting, arguing, not getting along, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And he developed what he called coercion theory. And basically, it's kind of like the golden rule in the sense what you give is what you get.
Right.
So that if, his correlation proves that if you give a lot of aversive, what we might consider aversive stimuli, yelling, nagging, you're going to get aversive stimuli kind of back. If you don't do those things, you're going to get, if you get more positive feedback, you're going to get more positive feedback back. And so Eric had developed a child observation clinic where I worked with him, where we would bring parents in and they would have, we'd have like little toys and they'd work with their little youngsters there. And we used the bug in the ear at that time. So it was, parents would put a little bug in their ear and we were in a one-way mirror and we would kind of guide them in terms of what to do. Oh, look at, you ask the youngster, try to be a little more specific in your request. Don't give a general request, play nice, say something a little bit, more specific. Oh, take your toys and, show me how a car goes, things like that. When they complied, make sure you provide social positive consequences, try to minimize your yelling, nagging, and those types of things. So that was kind of like where I'd always been going on and some of the initial work that I had done, but it wasn't applied behavior analysis at that point. It was called behavior modification was sort of the ongoing clinical term for the type of work that we were kind of doing.
And correct me if I'm wrong, John, though, that's all under the rubric or the umbrella of psychology, right?
That's correct.
My oldest that we were chatting about before we hit the record button, she's looking at colleges right now and thinking about what she wants to do. And she asked me, she's like, Dad, did you always want to be a behavior analyst? And I'm like, well, there was no ABA real. I mean, right. there was behavior analysis, but we were all psych majors, and
that's correct. That's correct. So. Yeah, I got basically a degree in sort of a science degree and master's degree in psychology. It was it was really the psychology department. You're 100% correct in terms of, how we would go about things, and once we tried to go out into the field and get work and get paid, you were a psychologist. Basically, that's how you sort of marketed yourself in terms of, trying to do clinical types of work with people.
John, were there specific kind of aha moments when you were watching these parent-child interactions? Can you talk a little bit? That just sounds that type of work just sounds really. It's so needed. And I'm not sure who's doing that type of work these days. I suppose Alan Kasdan probably is the example that comes to mind. But it's not. I wonder sometimes, how widely disseminated these strategies and tactics are.
That's an interesting point. I don't see it being. Now again, I'm not dealing in that with neurotypicals very much anymore. Now all my work is in with autistic spectrum disorder youngsters and language. So I'm far away from that. But I think you might be correct in terms of, I am involved in behavioral health agencies, and they do see, youngsters who would be more oppositional defiant or conduct disorder, some of those diagnostic categories. And you definitely, when I talk to people, you definitely hear the same stories that I was, being told by parents 30, 40, 40 years ago, and the idea being basically is that you have to develop. Parents aren't, you don't go to school to become a parent. You don't have to take a test of any kind, or, you just have to sort of know, you just
have to make them.
You just have to make them, and then you kind of, they give them to you, and you take them home, and you go, well, holy mackerel, what do we do? But but yeah, his stuff is great. If anybody wanted to, just Wikipedia Jerry Patterson or that group you'd find, or the Oregon Research Institute, you would really find some very, very interesting types of works and materials there.
Awesome.
And
one real thing, real quick, just for the listeners, what we'll try to do is just everything we talk about, we'll put a link to it or run down the links and put them in the show notes for this particular episode.
Yeah, that would be great, because Eric also worked with Russell Barkley.
Oh yeah,
it's kind of like the guru with ADHD type of symptomology.
For sure.
And he and Russell published a number of textbooks and things like that. And he became very good friends and worked with Russell. And I got eventually, I've come into contact with a lot of Russell's work. And again, it's very, 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 very similar in terms of the type of things, he's doing with trying to set up more positive programs as opposed to punitive programs. And
what's interesting, as a total aside, I listened to a podcast, it must have been 5 or 6 years ago, and Russell Barkley was the interview subject.
Oh yeah.
And he went on and on and on about extolling the virtues of B.F. Skinner, which, for me, it came as a bit of a surprise, because I don't think of him as a behavioral psychologist.
Yes.
But it was like, I was like, wow, that was really unexpected. And he talked about the virtues of operational definitions and so on and so forth. I was like, holy cow, this went in a totally different direction. Than I was expecting.
Yeah, I mean, some of his clinical manuals and materials are basically the same thing. It's trying to teach parents, more positive ways of interacting, more or less punitive ways of discipline. Try to get away from the nagging, yelling, screaming, basically coercive interchanges where you try to bully somebody into trying to do something. Because basically you just get kind of eventually bullied back once the power structure kind of gets equalized a little bit with things like that. So
yeah, once they reach adolescence and get that little streak of rebellion. I'm totally not correct. Talking about personal experience. No,
I'm sure you're not.
So one of the things we were chatting about offline here is that your career took a little bit of a detour into the building trades. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, what was happening was I was up at Alberta, and I got married, and my wife and I drove up. We always remember we bought a Volkswagen Beetle. We paid $1,900 for it. And we drove up to Canada. And one of the interesting things about the University of Calgary is that the winters are brutal, very, very cold, that you had to actually get a heater for your oil pan. And you had to actually plug your car in so that the oil wouldn't freeze. Mm-hmm. And you'd be able to start your car the next day. But anyway, so my wife, there became an opportunity. It was actually, there was a huge flood where we lived. It was in the early 70s. They had a tremendous flood. And as a result of the flood, there was a lot of money. And my family was in the trade business. They were electricians. My father was an electrician. My uncle was an electrician. My mom worked for the electrical union. My dad was best friends with the business agent. And the business agent is kind of like the king of unions. They're the one who, assigns you jobs and things like that. So my mom said, John, if you want to take a break from school, you can come back here and you can make fairly, a nice little nest egg for you and your wife if you wanted to take a break from that. And I was getting a little bit of the, graduate school fatigue. And I said, okay, I have I just finished my master's. I'll take a break from that and we'll come home. And I worked as an electrician for maybe about 2 or 3 years in terms of the flood recovery type thing. We would basically have to get buildings back up this, because they were all totally, all the electrical equipment and everything was all destroyed. So you had to basically put whole new infrastructures in for all these buildings and things like that. So there was a lot of overtime. There was a lot of money. So I was able to sort of create a nest egg and, get away from having to do term papers and things like that, which, after a while becomes tedious. You hand them in, they hand them back, you hand them in, they hand them back, you hand them in, they hand them back.
Well, from a reinforcement perspective, I guess there's a tangible outcome that's, when you build something or fix something or whatever, the gratification is right there.
With electrical work, the gratification, as soon as you hit that switch, the light comes on. But
yeah,
we did it. You put the plug in. Oh, you got power. Ta-da! It is immediate, and it's very, very nice, and very, people are so happy that you're doing it and providing that sort of immediate thing. And I enjoyed working with the fellows. They're, they all most of them knew my dad, and so that they all treated me nice, and so it was a very, 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 very pleasant experience that we had there for a number of years.
Did you become a licensed electrician, or I know there's various stages of
you're right.
rank or whatever,
You are correct. There's like an apprenticeship program where you become eventually a journeyman electrician. Is kind of like when you've passed everything. I worked on what they call the permit. In other words, they just allow me to, and the people that I work with, they knew that I wasn't a journeyman electrician. So they didn't give me work in terms of the real brain parts of the job. I was more of the carry the pipe, bend the pipe, pull the wire, like that kind of thing. More of the grunt laborer types of works involved with it.
It's interesting. I had planned to ask you this question anyway, but it just in that last response, though, it made me think of this even more. Given the need of, I don't know what it's like where you are right now, but I know in New England, or at least in my neck of the woods, northern New England, the building trades are just hurting for people to become skilled tradesmen or tradespeople or whatever. And it's one of those things where, if you need some plumbing done, you need some electrical work done. And if it's not an emergency, you're going to wait, and you're going to wait a long time. And
I know you're correct. I mean, it is really, for somebody who's really not interested in academic type of work, this could be a very, very, especially electrical, at least from my perspective, electricians, we always sort of considered ourselves sort of like the elite of the trades. Now, of course, that was us, of course. That we had more brains than brawn in terms of the type of work that we were doing, and it has a great system in terms of you do an apprenticeship where you basically are out in the field working with a skilled journeyman, and that journeyman will guide you in your basic understanding, and you're also then at night going to school where you're learning more of the more academic aspects of electrical type of work. So you spend about 5 to 6 years in that apprenticeship type of program, and they'll move you around to different types of work and different types of jobs. So you're getting, an awful lot of experiential things. And I know that's what, if we take a quick right turn here, is that, when we talk about the BAC board and things like that, they try to do that in terms of the, field work experience and things like that. But you're not really working with the individual who's supervising you. That person sort of just tries to help you out with whatever you're doing. And it's not like you're moving around to different types of work. You're not, like doing rotations, maybe like a doctor would do. A doctor would rotate through different fields within the hospital, where they do pediatrics and then they do, orthopedics or, do various branches. We don't necessarily have a lot of that within our, within our trades, trying to get our skills up for our BCBA types of things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One exception comes to mind, and we actually did a show on this a few months ago. Dr. Becca Tagg at Del Mar Behavioral Health in North Carolina. We did a whole show on clinical rotation, and she comes from the clinical psych world where that is more common, where you do some geriatrics, you do some pediatrics, and yada yada yada. And that's something that she's instituted in her program. I know some other providers are trying to do the same thing, but it's very difficult, and it comes at a cost for the provider, because it's obviously more work, more non-billable time, etc.
Right.
But but that sort of model of working at the side by side with the accomplished practitioner, I think, is something that we'd all love to see more.
Yeah, exactly. And then what happened with me then was I had to make a decision. Would I continue in the trades and sort of formally get into the apprenticeship program, or would I try to find work? Work. And lo and behold, I was getting the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and there was a job ad in the journal. That was way back when they had job ads, I guess, and it was for work at a state school and hospital, the Ebensburg State School and Hospital, which was in the western part of Pennsylvania. So my wife and I discussed it, and I said, well, let's kind of see, let's see if this works out. And I did apply, and I was interviewed, and they did give me the job. And basically, I was to do behavior modification type of work with individuals who were in a very skilled type of cottage environment. And it was a social and rehabilitation grant where our goal was to try to teach these individuals some basic living skills: dressing, toileting, eating. I mean, in those days, like at Ebensburg State School and Hospital, when I went there, they had like cottages, little building as cottages. And the cottage basically had what they called a main room, and then there were like different dorm wings. So it's extremely sterile and, very depressing type of environment there. And I remember that they walked me over to the cottage where this grant was working, where I would be working. And the main thing I noticed initially was, for some reason, there was this large fence around the building that I was going to. And I couldn't understand why did this building have a large fence and the other buildings didn't. And the reason, of course, was that the individuals that are within there were individuals who were placed there because they had severe behavior problems and aggressive behavior and things along those lines. So they were looking for somebody, who could fit in and work in that situation. And that's where I met Alan Kasdan. One of the crazy things about my career is I've somehow been able to kind of serendipitously meet with these people. And I worked with Alan for a couple of years. He was at that point at Penn State University. He and I would, as a consultant, would maybe come in a couple times a month. And we would work with a client together, in terms of doing, shaping and task analysis and teaching them how to, get dressed and do toileting and eating and those types of skills. But, again, it was, you sort of looked at yourself as what is this really doing for that person's life? At this point in time, there wasn't really the community push for individuals to be in group homes and out in the community and things like that. At this point in time, it was still more of a state school and hospital, where, if I could use the term, warehousing type of a format with individuals. But that was a very interesting couple of years that I spent with Alan there at Ebensburg State Hospital. Of course, he's done pretty well for himself.
Of course. As an aside about Alan Kasdan, he's the one of the few guests who's he declined to come on the podcast, and this is a skill. This was amazing. Like, it was the most beautifully crafted no response I've ever received.
That's Alan. That's his whole mantra is how to say no, but yet it's not aversive. It was
total. He nailed it. I was like, I'll be damned. Wow, I'm actually pleased to receive this email. Like, how do you do that? Like, how can I do that?
Yes.
It was really amazing.
He is such a funny guy. He's very, very witty and very, very clever.
All right. So anyone out there in listener land, if you have an in with the good Dr. Kasdan, please put in a word for behavioral observation. So.
Right. He's at the Yale Child Study, I think now, somewhere, something like that.
Yep.
And he has a number of great resource books too, in terms of dealing with very, very difficult families.
Oh, yeah. He sent me all sorts of stuff. Like, he's you might be interested in this. You might be interested in this. It was really like the email itself was quite amusing. I think I saved it just for posterity because it was it was such a model of how to do that right.
He's great at doing those things. I think last year or the year before, he just received a major award from the ABAI. I think when we were still doing virtual, because I know
Okay.
that it was in Maryland. I think 2 years ago, maybe it was in Maryland, and we're scheduled to be in Maryland. Then it got
Yes.
because of the pandemic. And E and I and the group that I work with, we were scheduled to do a workshop. And I was super excited because I saw that Alan Kasdan had been invited to receive this award. So I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I'm going to get a chance to kind of meet Alan after all these years and, say hello. And then of course the pandemic kind of put this pause to that and everything was virtual. So I didn't actually get a chance to come down and kind of meet him and talk to him at that point in time. But he was he was a great guy to know and to meet and to work with there for a couple of years. And then I moved back to Wilkes-Barre. My wife and I were at that point considering starting a family. And in our discussions, we thought it would be better to try to be a little bit closer to home. And Evansburg is obviously not the kind of place where you want to spend the rest of your life in Evansburg, I'll tell you that. So we moved back to our area where our families and friends were. And then it became the job of trying to get a job as a psychologist now. Because again, there wasn't like this, demand for BCBAs or applied behavior analysis. That none of that was existing.
Yep.
And I got a job at it was the Child Development Council, which was a daycare provider. And I got a job as the director of their early intervention program, in which they would, the goal was to integrate youngsters who had some sort of intellectual disability of some kind into generic daycare centers. Or a mainstreaming was the term that was used at that point in time. Now it would be inclusion would be the term that you would use. And so we would have youngsters in there. And I would do some psychometric work and some behavioral counseling and some programming in terms of, what skills you should you try to teach the youngsters to, move them up the ladder and things like that. So I worked in that. And then at that point in time, I started to span out a little bit with my work. I started to do consulting work with different groups. And I got a job at Step by Step because they had what was called the core team. And their job was to help with group homes, that they're individuals that were in group homes that may have some behavioral challenges, how to help the staff in terms of working with these individuals. And so we would use reinforcement programs and set like that, working in the group homes. And then I sort of got a job as a consultant for the intermediate unit. Pennsylvania has IUs, which are special education kind of branches, broken up into different areas within the state. And I got a job with them in terms of working with some of their I think they were called emotional support classrooms, which were basically youngsters who had, acting out behaviors, oppositional, defiant, those kinds of groups. And I would try to help them in terms of developing, token reinforcement programs and incentive programs, trying to use some of the skills that I learned in my days with Eric Mash and Dr. Patterson. Excuse me, in terms of working, trying to develop more of those positive systems, as opposed to control systems and things like that. So I started to spend a lot of time doing those types of things.
I see. Go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm just, as you can see, once I get in a roll, I just keep going.
That's good. That's good. The less talking I do, the better in these, I find. So, it one of the things that I think is noteworthy about the arc of your career, it seems like you've had a chance to kind of work with some of the greats in various areas that you've already described. And I know you've worked with a lot of folks who are, I guess, giants in the verbal behavior field. You've done some work with the Carbone Clinic and others. So I'm curious about. And then you got really into RFT, right? And so I want to hear how what was your first exposure to RFT? What did it provide that perhaps the verbal behavior? And I just hate using that term as a generic label, but
I understand
it is perhaps the most convenient one, if not the imperfect, albeit imperfect, but. So what How did you first come in contact with RFT, and what made it important to you? What made it go, oh, this is a really something that I really get, or I can really see how it works here? What does it offer that perhaps other accounts of language and cognition don't?
Yeah, well, just a little bit of the backstory there.
Please.
It was about, it was sort of in the early 80s. And at that point in time, the Lovas's YAP, Young Autism Project, really hadn't sort of taken phase yet. And I was working with some families through that Child Development Council thing. And one family who was economically very of means sort of tagged on to this idea that their youngster could receive this early intensive behavioral intervention type of work, and it might substantially result in major changes in them. And so this family got in touch with somebody from UCLA, and there was an Eastern branch, and there's a fellow by the name of Scott Wright who was around in our area and I think he's still involved with Lovas's Institute and Lovas's work. And that then he had consultants coming in working one-on-one, sort of like as the EIBI types of programs initially were run. And then we tried to then see how could we develop a way for other families to be able to partake in this type of service who didn't have the financial means to pay for the consulting fees and the costs for having individuals coming in. And so we were able to, some of the people were able to somehow work that it was able to be supported through medical assistance, or they're able to build insurance companies for this type of work. And it was at that point then that I got initially in touch, worked with Mary Jane Weiss and the Rutgers Autism Project, I think it was called at that point in time. Mm-hmm. And what Mary Jane's Weiss team would do is something that was very similar to the app team. They would come in as a group. She had about 6 or 8 therapists working under the group, and we would bring families in, and these individuals would do like a workshop with the youngster, develop a program for that youngster. They would leave, and then we would have therapists who would attempt to then do those similar types of programs with the youngster. Mm-hmm. So that's where I met Mary Jane Weiss, and I became good friends with a fellow by the name of John Bernard, who was one of Mary Jane's workers, and then once that happened, the next kind of step in the area was when the Department of Education in Pennsylvania developed this ABA supports program for classrooms. And that program was one that was designed so that a consultant would come in with the teacher, kind of help her set up a behavioral type program, and ABA evidence-based support types of programs for youngsters with autism, and provide ongoing consultative support and assistance. And that was Mike Miklos and Amiris DePiglia were kind of the main heads of that. And Dr. Kirby was kind of overseeing those. And that eventually I got involved with it when there were 10 classrooms, I think, across the state of Pennsylvania. Today, there are 900 classrooms involved. It's a major, major program across the state. It has done international presentations. And that's where I got involved with more, as the term that you use, like the verbal behavior model a little bit. Mm-hmm. The program sort of hitched its wagon with Vince Carbone. And Vince was a mentor for this program along with Mark Sundberg. But for many, many years, and Vince still continues to provide some workshops for them. I know he's retired now and he's living in Savannah, Georgia. But, we, in the early days, we used to be able to go up to his clinic. We would take a whole team up there. And he had this little clinic in New York, and he would have these detailed presentations for us. He was always meticulous in terms of these the workshops and the materials, and he was so generous in terms of sharing things with us. But we would go into like the conference room, and he'd be talking, and then all of a sudden, out in the clinic, you could hear some noise or a hubbub going on, and he would stop and he'd go, "I know who that is. This could be interesting. Follow me." So out we'd go, and we'd watch, and they'd work with somebody and try to help them through, a difficult situation, and he would give them advice. And excuse me again, his therapist would be working with the youngsters, trying to get them to be more effective at manding or requesting or something like that. Then we'd come back into the conference room, and then we'd have a debriefing on what it is that we saw, what it is they were trying to do. And he was just he was so generous about things. So that was kind of like my background. I became very familiar with sort of the basic ideas of it, and the basic early skills where you get the individuals to man, and you get the individuals to be able to do some tacting and some preliminary interverbals and things like that. And one of the things, again, that struck my interest initially, really was, well, how do we get them to not be rote? How do we get them to be more fluid in conversation, like we're having here, where we can just kind of go off and talk, and it's not there's no script in a sense, and the answers don't come out from being taught, kind of thing. And so I know there are chapters within the Verbal Behavior book by Skinner that kind of tries to deal with that. But I started to become interested in relational frame theory when I began to read some work by Dermot and Yvonne, and it just sort of struck me as, this is kind of interesting. This derived relational, this is kind of interesting. This is kind of like what we're looking for, that individuals can kind of figure things out. So in 2000, I went to the ABAI conference in Chicago because Dermot and Yvonne were presenting there. And I let them know that I was coming, and I met them afterwards, and we talked. And, I said I was very, very interested. I primarily do early intervention type of work with youngsters. I think that your stuff could be very interesting at that point in time. And, how can I, further move this along a little bit? And again, they were very generous, talked to me. Sometimes I would talk to them on the phone. We didn't have Skype and all those things at that point in time. So, we talk on the phone, blah, blah, blah. And they arranged for me to come out to Lake Tahoe in Nevada because Stephen Hayes, who obviously is one of the giants in terms of relational frame theory and ACT, etc., had a cottage somewhere out in Lake Tahoe. And for the summer, frequently, he would let Yvonne and Dermot rent the cottage from him. So they told me they were going to be out at Lake Tahoe, and if I wanted to come out and kind of spend some time with them, that this would work out. So I figured, what the heck, Lake Tahoe, don't so too bad. So I fly out to Reno and take a car and drive out to Lake Tahoe, and I meet with them, and I would go to the little place and meet with them. And that's where they introduced me to Ian Stewart. Ian Stewart was, I think one of their first graduate students. And so they basically passed Ian Stewart off to me. They said, "Here, Ian, here's a guy. He has some ideas on early intervention. Why don't you two guys work together and kind of see what you can come up with?" And that's how I got really, really interested in and began all my work in, kind of like relational frame theory and et cetera, all of those types of things with Ian. And we started to develop the TARPA, which was a computer-based program, training and assessment of relational precursors and ability. And we began to publish some work, and then in, I think it was 2004 or 5, that's when Siri came to one of our, it was again at Chicago again. We were doing a workshop, we were presenting it, we were talking about generativity, and it's not really response generalization, it's not stimulus generalization, it's just something different. It's a different skill that we're talking about here. And that's where Siri, who had worked with Mark Sundberg and things out in California, became very interested, and she eventually went to the University of Galway, where Ian's a professor out there, to study to become a doctor with him out there.
Okay, so this is Dr. Siri Ming, just for clarification.
Yes,
for
I'm
those
sorry,
who are,
right.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's Dr. Siri Ming. And so then the three of us then would begin to work on things. And so that's where I really became very, very interested in trying to use this in terms of, programming for youngsters.
So I have a question for you, John. I have.
Is it a hard question?
Yeah. Well, of course.
Okay.
So I have listeners who kind of span the spectrum, I guess, of
Sure.
Perhaps the traditional approach versus the RFT approach in terms of, and so on and so forth. And for those in the former category, every time I have someone come on and talk about RFT, someone will write me and say something like, it's hard to get a very concrete definition of what this is, and
Sure.
and that's perhaps perhaps a more charitable characterization of some of the messages I get. So just leave that there. But
I can understand that.
So what would you say if you could speak directly to someone who's skeptical about this approach? What would you say? How would you define relational frame theory? Let's just start there, I suppose.
Okay, I think the main characteristic that that you would look at what relational frame theory talks about is what's referred to as arbitrary applicable relational responding, which is referred to as AARP. And basically, if you think of language or words, basically words are referential in the sense that a word refers to something. So that when I say cat, for example, and I use my subtle behaviors to produce that sound, that in the social verbal community that Matt, you and I live in, when I say cat, you hear that sound, and you have a reference to that in terms of you're able to make a relation between that sound and that reference. And it's arbitrary in the sense that that word and that sound bear no physical characteristics of that. It's just, just sort of an arbitrary thing that we have decided that Homo sapiens have worked out as a way of being able to make references to things that exist kind of in the real world. And basically what RFT indicates is that's what they mean by a relation. We relate that sound, to that object. And now by being able to do that, I'm able to do other relations with those sounds, in the sense of when we're conversing now, we're basically kind of, putting all these different words together to make meaning for it in terms of that. So that what relation, and it's an operant, we learn how to do this. We're obviously have biological structures through evolution that make it easier and easier for us to do these things. But we basically learn it, in our interactions with our family and things like that. There's, it's like today you'll hear people talk about naming, or they talk about bidirectional naming. That's basically that referential idea where you have, something refers or is a relation between something, and it's an arbitrary relation. We learn that these sounds and symbols have meaning in a sense. They have, and we learn to do that. And relational frame theory views that as the core to language, and actually the core to a lot of human behavior. And then because there are certain things that when we start to develop this skill that we do, there's basically the first nod where we have what's called mutual entailment within relational frame theory, and that's where naming would be kind of an example of that. That if you learn, somebody teaches you the name of something, and they ask you, you can then, if you see different things out there, and somebody says, "Can you find X?" You can find it because you have that listener skill, or somebody brings it up to you and says, what is that? You can tell them what that is. That's kind of like what the basic idea of kind of naming or mutual entailment is. But then relational frame theory then starts to take it out a little bit. It says, well, there's more than just the first node. There are multiple nodes in the sense that you can add another variable in here. You can say that, a cat is also called a feline, or feline is the same name as a cat. Now you have three things. You have the actual cat, you have the name cat, and now you have another arbitrary relation in terms of feline for cat. And so now they become kind of like all interchangeable. And so that now that you have a mutual entailment, you also have now a combinatorial entailment. So in the sense that if I said, what's a feline, you could say, oh, it's a cat. Cat, it's another name for a cat. Or somebody says, can you find the feline, in this picture? You could point to the cat. So you'd be able to do that without having to be directly taught that. If you were taught that the word cat and the word feline are basically kind of like the same. And then what the big game changer seems to be from this perspective is that what they refer to as transformation of function. That just basically means that learning, what we consider our basic learning functions, like reinforcement, discrimination, conditional discriminations, SDs, S delta, all those kinds of things, they can be changed by putting things into relational networks. So if I said to you, and that felines, they're very nice. I love felines. They're so cuddly, and you can just pet them and things like that. There potentially is now a transformation of function for the word cat and for the word, for an actual cat, in terms of now if you saw a cat, you go, oh, wow, they're cuddly. So I'll go over and pet it because they're nice. The function, the SD now for the cat, has become an SD for reinforcement and things like that. But if I said the opposite, you don't want to go near a cat. They're uppity. You go near them, they'll scratch you. Cats are bad. Don't go by cats. And if you saw a cat now, you would go, no, I'm not going to say hello. Go the other way, kind of thing. And once that happens, that means that you don't actually have to have contact or learning experiences for functions to change. It can change because of relational networks that are brought into bear. Now, I'm sure Stephen Hayes and Dermot Barnes are turning over in their graves, if they had graves, but they're turning probably their eyes shut and trying to erase any contact they have with me. But that would be kind of some of the things I would talk to somebody about.
Okay.
In terms of kind of like what the relational frame theory kind of thing is.
Very, very good. And so it sounds like once you discovered this, you kind of jumped in with both feet and went off to the races.
I really loved it. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I want to get into in a minute is that I know you're doing a series of workshops for our friends at Peak Behavioral Services.
Peak Behavioral Service, that's correct. They told me, make sure you say that a few times.
That's right. Peak Behavioral Services. Peak Behavioral Services.
That's right. They're a great company. I love working for them.
Yeah. And so we're going to get into that work in just a moment here.
Sure.
But I guess one of the things I'd like to do before that is to talk about what so I think you used the term game changer a few minutes ago. What did you see in terms of outcomes with the learners you were supporting when you started to think of things with this RFT lens and, more to the point, program with an RFT focus?
Yeah, what it did was it changed for me the focus on what we were trying to do. The goal now became to develop a skill, not to develop sort of like the number of things a person can do within a skill. And what I mean by that is you can teach a person to imitate through direct contingency, shaping, etc. But your goal should not be to have a whole list of things that they can imitate that you taught them. Your goal should ultimately be that they become a generalized imitator, that they learn how to imitate. So if somebody does something new that they've never seen before, they're able to now try to produce some sort of similar type of behavior. It becomes a very adaptive, the term often used now is behavioral cusp or higher order operant, something along those lines. They learn like a skill with it. You can also see it with some other early, like a echoic behavior or matching behavior, and we can talk more about that. But then you get into that you learn the skill of arbitrarily relating and learning how to do that in terms of through practice, multiple exemplar instruction. You're able to do that. You're able to learn the names of somebody says something is a name of something. You don't have to directly teach them now what the listener skill is or what the tack is. They can do that, and they can learn basically from this generative process. And when you think about it, when we're trying to do inclusionary practice with our students, our students may be in a small controlled environment initially where there's a lot of one-on-one work with them. But ultimately, they're going to have to go, into a classroom with 20 of their peers, and somebody's going to be up at the front of the desk, and they're just going to be talking away. And, you have to be able to profit from and learn from that experience. And that's basically the idea within this model, or, the types of skills that we're trying to teach. That's what the book that we wrote initially, an RFT approach to generative language, volume 1, at Hedgehog Publishing. There, I got that in.
All right.
And Siri. And we have volume 2 coming out probably this summer. We finished that one. And that basically tries to walk practitioners through kind of this, some of this process to try to develop more of a kind of a skill-based model, which again, I the other programs do as well too. But I think the relational frame theory to me helped kind of guide into what steps and what areas, we really want to try to have the curriculum, be produced with youngsters.
I see. And so let's talk a little bit about the workshops you've got coming up. So if people are listening to this and want to learn more, maybe if they're skeptical about RFT, and
are you saying that didn't change hearts and minds?
Well, I'm just
okay.
We'll
All
see.
right.
We'll see. This.
Okay.
I will not be taking a poll on this, but yeah, just in case, in the unlikeliest chance that someone remains unconvinced,
okay, right,
based off of that, and they want to learn more, and they want to ask you all the yeah but questions. Let's talk a little bit about the workshop, what you've got going on.
With peak behavior. I've been working. The primary person that I work with at peak behavior is Elena Lawson. Who's the BCBA that I initially worked with them when out. Peak is in Wyoming, and how I got hooked up in Wyoming was my son was living in Wyoming. He was a super duper avid outdoor kind of guy, and he eventually ended up in Jackson, Wyoming, where there's lots of places for guys to do super duper kind of outdoor things. Like a rafting guide and a snowboard instructor. He's a a snowboard super enthusiast, and that's where he met his wife. So I don't know how I saw it, but there was an ad for some in Wyoming, peak behavior. They were looking for somebody, and I thought, okay, I'll see what the heck. And all of a sudden, I called, and I met Brad, who's the founders of the company out there, and we began to work together. And so eventually, now what we thought might be helpful is we have a series of seminars. We have the first seminar deals with sort of the non-arbitrary aspects needed, the building blocks needed to get into more of the advanced skills. So we talk about generalized imitation and generalized matching and generalized echoics, and we talk about fluency. And one of the big things when we talk about fluency is the idea that you have to consider rate is an important metric, because as you and I talk, we're talking at a certain pace. And there is kind of like a norm for speaking rate for for people in our culture. In the it's like about 150 to maybe 200 words per minute. If you watch John Oliver, it's about 500 words per minute, but some of them are much, like us, we're going. So that if you're going to be able to be immersed in this, you have to be able to be fluent in your ability to do these skills, because the information is coming quickly, and it's not a simultaneous, it's a successive, in a sense of, as I say things, they disappear. So they're not like a permanent product that you can kind of see and go back to and refer to, in a sense. So we talk about what are fluency aims and how to create fluency aims that relate to speaking rate, and we give people some idea on that. And then the second webinar, we talk about moving into kind of like the precursors. We talk about observational learning. We talk about joint control. We talk about recombinative generalization, some of those skills that we incorporated in it. Then the third one is we basically get into the sort of the equivalence or coordination frame we talk about. And that's your basic naming frame. And then in terms of being able to learn incidentally, so that if somebody just showed you something and said what it was, later in time, you'd be able to say what it was if somebody asked you, or find what it was if somebody asked you to locate it, without you having to go through somebody prompting, transferring, all that thing. You just learn it. And then the fourth one is when we start to move into some of the more other frames that relational frame theory kind of proposes, so that we move into frames of distinction, same, different, some comparative or adjectives, bigger, smaller, those types of things, spatial, in front of, behind, on top of, those types of things. So then we start to introduce people to some of those other concepts and how you kind of work with them.
Very cool. So it sounds really interesting. And we'll have links out in the show notes, but the Peak Behavioral website where people can learn more is pkservice.org.
Right.
And that sounds like a really neat series of seminars.
I think it will be. I mean, it's basically we're trying to provide some sort of coaching ideas to individuals who are starting to work in this and are looking for some, ideas to kind of incorporate within their toolbox of skills to try to work with individuals and things like that. And again, the mindset, from my perspective, should be that you're trying to develop, sets of skills or behavior cues, or that's because the individual is not going to be in a one-to-one. You don't want them to be in that environment. That's just sort of a bridging, rehabilitation kind of model where you're trying to jumpstart them and try to get the trajectory back sort of on track. And that's what we talk about a lot in the book, and some of the clever things that Siri did in terms of a lot of her research, and some of the other researchers that have worked with, Dr. Stewart in Galway out there. Ian's a funny kind of guy. He's a very interesting guy.
All right.
Interesting guy.
So as awesome as the seminar sounds, if there are other resources that people are interested in, that someone's listening to this podcast right now.
Well, obviously the number one resource is obviously the book, RFT Approach to Generative Language from Hedgehog Publishing Company. That's our little book. You can also find some material with Mark Dixon in Peak Systems, PEAK. Mm-hmm. They've done an awful lot of work with and they have a number, I think a 4 or 5 volume set of materials, kind of walking people through, somewhat similar to what I talked about in terms of the webinars, in terms of some beginning skills and then kind of moving up the ladder as you get more and more complicated.
Oh yeah,
and
Mark's been on the show many times, so yeah, we definitely have talked about Peak.
Okay, so very good.
He's got some new stuff coming out too, so hopefully we'll hear from Mark soon.
Yeah, he always has stuff coming out. I know he I think they more standardize some of their assessment tools and things like that, and I know he works with Jordan Biles, I think he is, from Missouri, who's a real sharp guy. He's got a lot of good ideas and interesting things, and so those are probably some of the major kind of applied sense. And then in terms of the basic historical sense, you have the relational frame theory, post-Skinnerian approach to language, referred to as the Purple Book.
The Purple Book, yeah.
The famous Purple Book, in which they kind of laid out some of these basic ideas and some advanced ideas in it with them. And that obviously sort of translated into ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, to some degree. And so I never, in my work, never got into that sort of end of it, the more therapeutic type of end of it with more neurotypicals, although it is done with high functioning individuals in terms of skills. But I've been more in terms of the real, or my work is really with younger children in terms of, trying to get those skills. That's where I do my, all my work really now is spent doing that. I will do some work with behavioral issues a little bit, but basically all my work now is in that area of, youngsters and these skills, and helping people who work with them to coach them in terms of where to go, in terms of what skills to look for, and how to kind of sequence those skills, and what skills they need if they're having trouble, and how can we troubleshoot and build some skills to get to that point.
So the again, people, if they're interested in those seminars, the series of webinars, it's at pkservice.org, and the folks at Peak Behavioral also going to offer listeners a discount code and the code's podcast 22, all over lowercase. I'll have all that stuff in the show notes as usual, so you can go to behavioralobservations.com and look for this particular episode to get all the details. So John, what we're about almost out of time here, but before I let you go, we've covered a whole, we've covered, I guess 30 odd years of your, plus of your career.
We're more past 30. We're
okay. Well, details are, the details, but anyway,
30 plus.
Yes. Yeah. So given your perspective, I suppose, what advice do you have for the newly minted BCBA? Someone, just finished their coursework and supervision, just passed the test, they're in their new job. What would you have to say to that individual in terms of advice?
Yeah, I really think they try to find a mentor or somebody, a coach who's actually done the work that you're kind of going into, and see if you can develop that type of relationship, either whether it would be something that you, sort of a purchase, or if somebody's offering coaching services and you think, well, wow, maybe if I kind of met with somebody for a little bit, I can kind of advance my skills and those types of things, and view this as basically, trying to get a residency or as much experience as possible as you can. Because,
okay.
I think that kind of would be my kind of initial advice to somebody.
Yeah, definitely finding a mentor is one of the is a theme that comes up quite a bit in when I ask these questions. So
try to find an old wise behavior analyst.
Well, trying to find an old behavior analyst is hard, because the demographic I guess chart would be skewed towards towards the younger. So guys like you and me are like kind of like dinosaurs.
Yeah, we'd be on the left side of the bell curve.
That's right. And so and I always try to encourage people not to conflate longevity with skill too. There are a lot of really sharp young practitioners out there as well.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Don't it's important for folks to keep that in mind. So having said all that, definitely. John, this has been a really fun conversation. I'm glad the technical gods smiled upon us finally and let us have this interview. I was really afraid we're going to have to cancel there for a minute and reschedule. So, all right.
That's great.
All right. So thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.